All right, good morning, everyone. It is Thursday, October 20th, 2022, and this is the regular meeting of the California Fair Political Practices Commission. Ms. Lincoln, would you please take the roll?
Commissioner Baker?
Here.
Commissioner Gomez?
Here.
Commissioner Wilson?
Here.
Commissioner Wood?
Here.
Chair Matich?
Here. Well, good morning, everyone. Before we begin, I want to extend a special welcome to our newest commissioner, Dr. Jose Gomez. This is the first opportunity for him to join us here. So congratulations and welcome to the team.
I want to apply.
Yes, as we should. All right, let's go ahead and proceed then. We'll go to item number 1. This is public comment for items not on today's agenda. Do we have any public comment? Hearing and seeing none, we'll proceed to item 2, approval of the September 2022 commission hearing minutes. Do any commissioners have edits or comments to the meeting minutes?
Move to approve.
I will second. Is there any public comment on item 2? Hearing and seeing none, Ms. Linker, please call the roll.
Commissioner Baker?
Aye.
Commissioner Gomez? Commissioner Wilson?
Aye.
Commissioner Wood?
Aye.
Chair Matich?
Aye.
The motion passes.
All right, we'll proceed now to our consent calendar. It is identified as items 3 through 5. My understanding from Enforcement Chief Brereton, though, is that item 5 is going to be pulled from the calendar. I'll give you a second to settle in.
Good morning, Chair and Commissioners. Yes, we will remove item 5. Yes, item 5.
Right. Thank you. So the remaining consent calendar consists of items 3 and 4. Do any commissioners wish to pull either item for separate discussion?
One quick question about item 4, so if we pull that one.
All right, let's pull item 4. Do we have a motion to approve item 3 on the consent calendar?
So moved.
Second.
Any public comment on item 3? Hearing and seeing none. Ms. Lincoln, would you call the roll, please?
Commissioner Baker?
Aye.
Commissioner Gomez? Commissioner Wilson?
Aye.
Commissioner Wood? Chair Matich?
Aye.
The motion passes.
All right, we'll proceed to item 4. This is in the matter of John Reed. Chief Brereton, do you have any opening comments for us?
Yes. So enforcement recommends approval of a 1-count stipulation for a total penalty of $3,000. This is a violation for failing to disclose sources of income from business entities in several statements of economic interest. One of the sources had business before the Planning Commission, which Mr. Reed was a member of, and because of that, this violation is excluded from the streamlined program, which is why we are bringing mainline stipulation. But that is also the reason why for the other violations that we have for late reporting of these sources of income, we are recommending that those be included as aggravation because those others did not have business before the Planning Commission, so would have been included in our streamlined penalty program if those had been the only violations. Mr. Reed also has no prior history of violating the act, and he amended all of his statements of economic interest and agreed to a tolling agreement so that we could resolve this matter properly. Again, we recommend approval of a 1-count stipulation for a total penalty of $3,000.
Thank you, Chief Brereton. I have a question for you. I notice on page 3 of the stipulation, and I'm looking at lines 4 through 5. It states that in March of 2021, the respondent corrected and filed the corrected statements. Is that correct?
That is correct.
So at that point, the violation had been remedied to the extent the respondent could, and the only thing left was to decide on the penalty amount.
Not totally. So we have other factors that we consider when we are investigating a matter. I can't go into the specifics here, but our streamline program, for instance, it includes several factors that would include or exclude matters from the program. So we look for evidence of those items. We also have it once we are also investigating to get information regarding the factors for a mainline stipulation as well. So the factors that are in our regulation that, the degree of public harm, et cetera. So, so while we have the amendments, that doesn't necessarily mean that our investigation is complete at that point, so that we can determine whether any of these other factors may or may not be present or absent.
So in March of 2021, you didn't know whether the information that was amended involved a matter that was before the public official?
Yes, there were multiple entities involved. So, we're looking at each one for each case. We want to make sure that we're covering all of the factors for each of the missing pieces. So, yes, we're bringing this one count but we needed to confirm whether any of the others also met or did not meet the standards that are in the streamlined program regulations, as well as the mainline.
So that's what took a year and a half to ultimately get this back to us?
Correct.
Okay. Do other commissioners have questions for Chief Brereton? Commissioner Baker?
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Chair. I was kind of zeroing in on two parts, and the chair covered one. That did stand out to me that I'm going to use the terminology corrective action was taken a year and a half ago, and it's before us now, which just led me to wonder what was the source of that amount of time, if a year and a half to make those determinations. It's not often that we find one that comes up to us for adoption that has action taken that may have, again, corrected the issue, and then it takes a little while. So I just want to underscore that popped out for me as well, and take that as with whatever guidance that provides. It's interesting. If you can tell me this, before that action on March 21st, at the same part of the stipulation, it says there had been some back and forth already upon discussion with Reed, is how it mentions. How much of that looking into the factors had been done before he fixed it, and how much remained to be done after? And I know that's a difficult question, but I'm ultimately going to the year and a half until it comes up to us instead of maybe a month or two.
This particular matter is somewhat unique in that we had already had a case open and were investigating those allegations when another complaint came in dealing with the same issues but different timeframes. So in general, we had two investigation periods for this case, because we first looked into the original allegations, but then when we had the subsequent allegations, then they were similar and dealing with the same issues, just different timeframes. We included that with this case rather than opening a separate matter. So so that accounts for the time frame being a little bit different than some of our other cases.
And I know this part isn't in the stipulation, so consider this commissioner education, but how would you characterize an 18-month time period as typical for a situation where, again, I'm calling it corrective action, but I don't want to presume that that's the case, is taken before it comes to us for final conclusion? Or is it more likely that it can be, and typically is a shorter time period?
It depends on the case. So sometimes stipulations that we bring weren't necessarily the only violations that we needed to investigate. The allegations may have been much more broad, and we're going to look at all of the allegations that are within our jurisdiction. And oftentimes with statements of economic interest, late reporting specifically, there are there may be other issues involved, other allegations involving conflicts of interest. And those types of investigations do take longer than strictly looking at whether someone filed a statement or missed something that should have been reported. So, so that can account for some of the extra length of time. So sometimes when you see a simple, what seems like a simple stipulation may not have been a simple investigation along the way.
Understood, and I can certainly see that. My other area of inquiry for this is from page 4, lines 13 and 14, where it's mentioned that Reed signed a tolling agreement to extend the statute of limitations. And often in stipulations, we find that in almost the procedural history of the matter, and here it was in the discussion of factors for how a penalty may come out. And which was a little bit unusual to me. I wondered, the fact that the respondent signed a tolling agreement is not listed as one of the factors that we consider, but it's here. And that just made me wonder, because there might be some respondents who aren't going to sign a tolling agreement. And I wouldn't know that that necessarily means they're not cooperating, or they are, that should weigh as an aggravation. So I wonder if you can address why that used as a mitigation as opposed to a procedural history, because where it is in the stipulation, it came across to me as this is sign of cooperation and it weighs in his favor instead of it's a procedural point.
In this matter, we're using it as an example to show that we didn't find evidence that there was deliberate or intentional or an intent to conceal, because the respondent was willing to sign a tolling agreement and allow us the extra time to fully investigate the new allegations without causing detriment, or losing the other violations and having to file a PC report and go through that process, because that is lengthier and more work for our staff than a tolling agreement. And so for this particular matter, it was to show that that we didn't find intentional conduct, we didn't find a deliberate violation here, that this was just one of the things that we looked at to show, yeah, he's very cooperative and helpful with us, and really wanted to, make sure that everything was investigated properly.
I appreciate that. That one made me, I want to say nervous, but it was a caution for me. And I don't know that it's our practice to consider whether or not someone signs a tolling agreement, which typically is when I assume, getting close to a statute of limitations issue. They may be cooperating otherwise in every other way, but at least for my part, I'd be a little bit cautious of letting that be something that weighs in favor of someone, because it is their right not to sign a tolling agreement while still otherwise trying to cooperate. I don't know if that's a policy of ours. It's just, I haven't seen this. I don't remember seeing this appear in the way, tipping the scales of how much they cooperated. I just have a cautionary feeling about it. And I think that's my one commissioner feedback on that, unless you'd like to address that further, if that's a pattern of practice, because I usually see it somewhere else, and I think I'd be very careful about using that as a pro or con for someone. Thank you.
Sure. I will definitely work with my staff on that, and we'll make sure that we're using it in as appropriate for the facts of the cases.
All right. Thank you. Commissioner Wilson?
Okay. Thank you, Chief Brereton. Commissioner Baker raised some good points, but I wanted to go to page 3 on the stipulation. And it says that the maximum penalty that could be imposed would be $5,000. Why wasn't the maximum penalty imposed based on the facts that are outlined in this case?
We typically, when we're outlining what the maximum penalty is for in our stipulation, we're explaining what the maximum penalty is for the violations that we are charging, that we are recommending.
Right.
so we don't go into the other violations that we found here. We're using as aggravation only. We're not charging them separately. So we wouldn't include that in what our maximum penalty would be for this stipulation. That would be a different calculation that we would need to make, and we would also have to determine then whether each and every single one of those violations qualified as a violation itself, or would it be combined? Because sometimes we combine counts. So it's very tricky if we're using violations as aggravation to include that as our maximum penalty. We want to express what the maximum penalty is for what we are recommending charging.
Well, when I read through the stipulation and I see for a 5-year period, Mr. Reed did not report income. He was on the planning commission for 5 years, and it seems to me that he should have known what his obligation was as a public official. And I think the fine is too low, quite frankly, but I understand how you came to that conclusion. I don't know that I agree with the $3,000 fine. He repeatedly did not report sources of income that he knew he had earned, and those sources of income, exceed the fine in excess of 3 times. So a $3,000 fine to make $10,000 plus in income, that's a pretty good deal.
Thank you, Commissioner Wilson. Commissioner Wood, do you have any questions or comments for Chief Brereton?
I don't have anything to add. I really appreciate the conversation that you guys have had. I mean, I especially wanted to thank Commissioner Baker for bringing up the tolling issue. I hadn't really thought of it as, I had thought of it as cooperation, but hearing the way you framed it as kind of their right to agree to toll or not toll, and whether forfeiting their rights in that way should be counted for them, I think was really helpful for my own thinking. And then I guess the only other thing is I also thought it was a little bit lenient, but I'm willing to go along. So that's kind of where I'm at.
Thanks, Commissioner Wood. Commissioner Gomez? All right. Chief Brereton, I want to go back to revisit some of the comments you made in response to Commissioner Baker. And this tees off of the 18-month time frame between the remedial action and when this is coming before us. And if I understand you correctly, your explanation is that there was further investigation that needed to be done. That's correct?
Yes.
All right. Do we have timeframes or deadlines or parameters on how long investigations should take before they are concluded for different types of cases? I mean, not every case can be like down to this number of days, right? But certainly you could come up with bands of time. And I'm just curious, do we have that type of guidance that we're giving investigators and attorneys in enforcement to ensure we're moving things along as quickly as we can?
We do have some guidance in that, in general, we want to complete our investigations within a couple of years. This isn't anything, though, that we have like a policy written or things like that. It's more on our management team to make sure that our folks have the training and the resources that they need so that they can keep their matters moving. But it also, our workload weighs in as well, because one person can't get to 25 investigations simultaneously. So, balancing the different cases and the complexity of the different matters, we're trying to weigh and move things as quickly as we can, keeping in mind that there are sometimes workload issues. There are, other complications that can happen during investigations. So there are multiple factors that can weigh in on the time frame.
Okay. All right. Commissioner Wilson?
I didn't mean to ask this many questions, but I can't help myself based on some of the questions that were asked by my colleagues. At any given time, Chief Burden, do you know how many pending cases you have at any given time? I'm assuming you
We
know
do.
that, right?
In our, let me look at it really quickly. Right, yeah, yes, so each month we report in the executive staff reports how many cases we have.
And I've seen that,
Mhm.
and you do a great job disseminating that information. I'm mainly maybe let me clarify, I'm mainly asking that question for the benefit of those that are watching the hearing. At any given time, not a specific month, but roughly how many cases do we have pending at any given time?
Right now, I believe we have between 1,400 and 1,500 cases open.
Okay.
And that's not including like complaints that we have that are under review. So that's just open cases.
Okay, and then my second question, Mr. Chair, if I could ask a second question. In the case of a public official, let's take this case, for example. Are you able to tell them if they ask the question, how long do you think this case will take in terms of the investigation and coming to some kind of resolution? Or are you able to be that specific, or?
We cannot typically be that specific.
Okay, all right. Thanks for the clarification.
Thanks, Commissioner Wilson. Commissioner Baker?
Thank you. I appreciate that for the one stipulation we've got, you're helping us get through a lot of questions. And if I could summarize, I've gone back and looked at the comparable that you mentioned here. I'm very receptive to Commissioner Wilson's comment that this does seem lenient. And also Commissioner Wood, I don't want to put words in her mouth, seemed to be receptive to that comment as well. I would be inclined, this commission has given in the past guidance that we prefer to see a settlement closer to the higher end of the range than the lower end of the range. And for my part, I agree with Commissioner Wilson on that point and would be inclined to forego approval of this stipulation and encourage going back and seeking a penalty closer to the higher end. I would not suggest giving you a particular number, but in the past we have given feedback like that. And I'm with Commissioner Wilson on that feedback as well. That's what I would encourage. It's not a motion so much because I'm inviting the discussion among our colleagues.
Yeah, I would just say that the fine amount here is more than half. And the mitigating circumstances include that the public official here was, as I read this, diligent in disclosing the source of income when the matter came before him in the proceeding. And so that tells me he understood the important need to not vote on these matters. What he didn't do was timely report it on a report, but he was publicly announcing the conflict and that it was a source of income. So the public was provided with that information in real time, and he didn't vote on the matter. So there wasn't any self-dealing, may not be the right word here, but there wasn't any accusation of like pay-to-play type activity. And so I think this reads to me more of an innocent mistake. And so I personally think 3,000 is fair. And to your point, Commissioner Baker, you are correct. We have instructed as a matter of policy that we want higher fines, but we want higher fines not in every single case. That's never been what we've said. What we've said is in particular cases where there's high public harm, where there's intentionality in particular. And here, the fact pattern doesn't admit of intentionality. It admits of an oversight and negligence. I would have a very different view if the public official here had gone forward and voted on the matter and not disclosed it and not made the public aware of the source of income. But that's my view on it, trying to come to a reasonable, all the factors together.
Thank you.
Any other comment from the commissioners? All right. Any public comment on item 4? Hearing and seeing none, I'll move approval of item 4 as proposed.
Second.
Ms. Linker?
Commissioner Baker?
Aye.
Commissioner Gomez? Commissioner Wilson?
Aye.
Commissioner Wood?
Aye.
Chair Manich?
Aye.
The motion passes.
Thank you, Chief Brendan.
Thank you.
All right. I should have announced this at the beginning, but we are trying out a new video conferencing system. And so I don't know if the public notices the view, I think, should hopefully be different than it's been in prior meetings. Hopefully you find it to be an improvement. But we promised IT that we would take a break after this item so that it can take a few minutes and make sure the system is working properly. So we're going to take a quick break and we'll be back in 10 minutes. All right, we'll go ahead and reconvene back on the record. And we are on item number 6. It's the first of our general items. This is adoption of proposed amendments to Regulation 18410, requiring disclosures of individuals authorized to access a committee's bank records. And with us is Commission Counsel Caitlin Vieta-Oric. Good morning.
Good morning, Chair and Commissioners. Caitlin Vieta-Oric, Commission Counsel, presenting for adoption amendments to Regulation 18410 to require disclosure of the names of persons authorized to obtain the bank records of a committee on the Statement of Organization Form 410. And also with us today, we have Chief of our Commission's Audit Division. I don't know if you want to introduce yourself.
Good morning. My name is Shraddha Shah. I'm the Chief of Audits Assistance.
Good morning, Chief Shaw.
So the purpose of these amendments is to help facilitate efficiently obtaining necessary bank records for campaign audits and investigations when a committee treasurer is unavailable, unable to provide records, or is avoiding contact with auditors. Other individuals are often authorized to obtain these records in the treasurer's absence, such as the principal officer or candidate, but it's not always immediately known who has the authorization to obtain these records. In such cases, auditors from the Commission's Audit Division, as well as the Franchise Tax Board, audit staff rely on Commission's Enforcement Division to issue administrative subpoenas to the bank to obtain the records when an auditor cannot obtain them directly from the committee. In addition, sometimes the Enforcement Division is unable to serve the treasurer as required by law and must issue a subpoena to the bank to discover who else can be served in the treasurer's place for the bank account, making 2 subpoenas required to accomplish the task of obtaining bank records. This is a time-consuming process and can lead to it taking over a year to obtain the records and complete audits. Accordingly, this disclosure requirement will assist both the Commission and FTB staff, and also in releasing committee reporting information to the public in a timelier manner. There have been a few changes to these amendments that staff made since pre-notice discussion at the August 2022 Commission meeting, based on guidance from the Commission as well as from public comment. First, in response to the public comment received from the Sutton Law Firm at the August meeting suggesting professional treasurer firms be exempt from disclosure due to the large number of individuals who are in the firm that typically have authorization to obtain the committee's bank records, Commission staff proposes limiting the disclosure to the names of 2 persons other than the treasurer who have authority to obtain the bank records. This would limit the burden on the filers while also still providing the information to Commission's Audit Division as well as the FTB. Second, in response to public comment received from the California Political Attorneys Association in August regarding concerns that this disclosure requirement may lead to fraud, staff sought to include a requirement that the names be redacted from the Form 410 as discussed at pre-notice, but unfortunately after speaking with Secretary of State, we were informed that it's impossible to redact additional information or additional fields from what is already required to be redacted on the Form 410 due to their current software. So as a result, staff is unable to include the redaction requirement in this regulation amendment at this time. And then lastly, to avoid issues that may occur with the excessive number of filers filing at one time, staff recommends adding language providing that the Form 410 must be amended by July 1st, 2023 for committees existing prior to January 1st, 2023, which is before the proposed effective date of this regulation, or the amendments to this regulation, or by the time the committee is required to file another amended Form 410, whichever occurs earlier. So with those updates, I'm happy to take any questions or comments.
Thank you, Ms. Vieta-Oric. I do have a question for you. I wonder if you might be able to respond to the more recent comment letter, October 18th, 2022, we received from the California Political Attorneys Association, acknowledging some of the changes staff made to address some of their concerns, but continuing to raise a concern based in privacy, which as I understand it, just to tee that up, is not actually an issue that derives from our regulations. It is because a statute within the Political Reform Act requires the Secretary of State's office to, upon request, give unredacted copies of certain things to members of the public, including unredacted copies that include bank accounts, which is striking in today's sort of world where we try to protect private information. But nonetheless, that's the law that Secretary of State has to implement. So in light of that, to try and protect their privacy rights, CPA has offered as a suggestion that we amend Regulation 18401 as part of the record-keeping requirements. Why wouldn't, which would keep it from being publicly disclosed, the names of those two individuals? Why isn't that an appropriate way of approaching this?
So amending the record-keeping requirement would require the candidate or the treasurer to maintain this information, which would be the names of those persons authorized to obtain the bank records. However, if those records aren't maintained, or if we're unable to contact the treasurer or candidate, there may be a violation of the act. However, we still would not be in possession of that information and wouldn't be able to contact the appropriate person who would have it.
Right, we're in the same position we're in before that we're trying to solve,
Correct.
which is we need a live human being to authorize access to the records we need to fulfill our duty. Okay, I wanted to make sure I understood why that wasn't a good response. I will just say that I respect CPA's concerns. I do think that that it's a valid concern to be concerned about the privacy issue. My thought would be that we approve this regulation today, but delay its effective date until January 1st, 2024, to afford CPAA, or frankly, this commission could sponsor legislation to amend the PRA to align it more clearly with modern privacy standards, including that we don't give out bank account information to members of the public. That's my 2 cents, but I'll turn it over to my colleagues for additional questions or comments. Commissioner Baker.
Further, Vice Chair?
Oh, Commissioner Wilson.
Thank you. Ms. B. Etta Oric, okay. Some of the concerns I had, I think, will be addressed if the implementation date is delayed until January 2024, which I think is an excellent idea proposed by the chair. So I will refrain from additional comments because the privacy issue is my main concern, but delaying the implementation date would address that issue. So thank you very much for both of you for your detailed presentation.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Baker.
Thank you. I agree with the proposal. Appreciate the chair trying to find that solution. And I also agree that it's better than going for a record keeping approach instead, because much of the idea here is that those folks are not available. Even if they did keep great records, we're trying to reach people. So quite frankly, we could expeditiously move things along. One thing I would just add is if this is a statutory change, the statutory change is necessary for the Secretary of State to be able to do redacted copies. I would just encourage us to support that, encourage it. I don't know if that's already been broached with the Secretary of State's office, if they plan on perhaps taking lead on something like that. And if not, we may want to consider it in partnership with the Secretary of State, and hopefully they wouldn't object. And if so, we'd figure out what it is. But I want to give that feedback that we use that time to support getting that statutory change for redacted documents available.
Thank you, Commissioner Baker. Commissioner Wood.
So I am pretty sympathetic to the CPAA's concerns, and I wonder why we would adopt now, delay implementation, and try to get a legislative change. And if the legislative change came through, we would have to adopt something different. So that's like doing this twice, as opposed to trying for the legislative change on the front end, assuming we succeed with that, then adopting a regulation that would be more protective of privacy while still obtaining the goals. Because if we fail before the legislature, we could still go ahead and adopt this thing we're thinking about now, if it really seems necessary at that point. There's maybe some strategy stuff here that I'm not understanding.
Well, I think if I can respond to your point about having to do this twice, I think if the long-standing concern of CPA, because again, I want to emphasize the statute requiring disclosure of bank account information and the negative consequences for privacy has been an issue for several years. This is not new. Nobody has done anything about it. That's just kind of the reality at this point. However, we have had, my understanding at least, and Chief Shaw maybe wants to speak to this, significant difficulties proceeding with our cases so that we can resolve things in a timely fashion without having to seek tolling agreements, etc. So this really has to do with trying to alleviate some of the delays that we have had in prosecuting our enforcement actions because of not being able to find people who can authorize these records. So if we adopt the regulation today with a delayed effective date, and CPAA or ourselves, because we could sponsor this legislation ourselves, although that is a November discussion, I want to make that clear, that is not a today discussion. We could do that ourselves, and there's plenty of time then to resolve the statutory issue, and then our regulation can go into effect, and we can hit the ground running in the next election cycle. That's the benefit of doing it, and everybody knows that it's coming. We don't have to do it over again if we're successful on the legislative front. The regulation simply goes into effect. On the other hand, if nobody pursues the legislation for this long-standing issue during that 1 year, or it is not successful for whatever reason, we could, if we wanted to, either further delay implementation or explore other options at that point. But I'm a little reluctant to delay taking action to benefit our enforcement division and give them the tools that they need today because of a long-standing issue that, as I said, in my mind, nobody's just taken up in all these years. So that's my.
I see. That's really helpful. So it actually, it kind of gives us a little bit of a stronger leg to stand on actually before the legislature, like, hey, our enforcement is hampered here. We really need to be able to get this information, et cetera. I understand now. Okay, thank you.
All right. Commissioner Baker?
Thank you. I'm very grateful for that analysis. I wonder if we, in the interim, or at any time, like if the statute doesn't get fixed, changed, can request on the form and have it be optional but not required additional contact information. Like if that's something we even need to wait for now and leave it up to the people filing the forms if they want to optionally do that, with the requirement later being a requirement. I'm just curious if that's something that could also be done either in the interim or at any point. I just came up with that, so I don't know if that's advisable, but if you see some downsides, I see a lot of facial expressions. So again, I'm thinking of something where it's optional, but and it notes maybe that's optional, but we might get some additional helpful information in the meantime.
Council or Chief Shaw, either you want to respond to that?
I'm not entirely sure how we would go about doing that. I mean, it might be a possibility, but
I'm not either.
I would defer to General Counsel if he has any input.
I've seen no facial expressions from Mr. Bainbridge on this one.
He's good at that, though. He's got the poker face.
Good morning. My thought is I don't know that the people who would do it voluntarily are also, there's not a big Venn diagram in the middle of the people who would do this voluntarily and the people who were that were worried about not providing us this information or having treasurers that disappear on us. We'd have to think about how to write that into the law. I also think if someone wanted to put that information in the box on the form already, there's nothing that would stop them at this point. So I think it's an interesting idea, and I'm only thinking about it just now as you've said it. But my initial feeling is I don't know that it would accomplish all that much.
Okay.
Executive Director West, I see you grabbing the microphone. You have something to say.
I always have an opinion. I just don't always say it. But I think to add to what Mr. Bainbridge was saying, it doesn't necessarily have to be in the regulation. What we could do is in the instructions or the manual we could put in. You could also add extra names to this box and give the instructions in order if you wanted to be helpful. So we could show them the pathway to do it. Since it would be voluntary, it wouldn't need to be in the regulation.
That maybe even you can decide if it's strongly encouraged. There's a part of the manual about whether candidates put their disclosure information on signs, yard signs, right? It's not required if it's a candidate-controlled expenditure for yard signs, but it's encouraged. So there is precedent for that in our manual, if I understand correctly. I put that out there as a, perhaps something in the interim. And if it looks like it would work, because if it invites information that's helpful to us in the interim, I don't want it to take the pressure off of the statute getting changed, because that is way preferable. But that's my light bulb that went off.
Commissioner Gomez, any questions or comments? All right, anyone else? All right, is there any public comment on item 6?
Hi, I have a public comment.
Please.
Hi, thank you. My name is Casey Jenkins from Bell, McAndrews, and Hillpack, and I'm speaking on behalf of the California Political Attorneys Association. Thank you for considering our letter and taking a look at it. We've reiterated a lot that the fraud and the privacy concerns are real, so I appreciate you that we appreciate you, the commission, taking a closer look at that. Regarding the legislative fix that the chair proposed, while we would prefer that this information remain off the Form 410 and in the records as we propose with the record keeping requirement, if it were to go that way, I'd like to point to page 2 of our letter. In the middle 2 paragraphs, there are other options, so the Form 410 doesn't become too overcrowded. One is having the information listed on the 410 only if it is different than those individuals already required to be listed, like the treasurer, assistant treasurer, and principal officers. Because I know in the case of professional firms such as ours, these individuals are often the same people and may make the form a little less crowded. Another option could be to provide the name of a single custodian of records, and then in conjunction with the record-keeping requirements, that custodian would be the one to provide the list of those that have access to the bank account records. So I wanted to bring those options to the commission's attention, but we thank you for your consideration, and I'm happy to answer any questions if you have them.
Thank you, appreciate it. I do have a question for you. I think I'm correct in understanding this as being a long-standing problem of the statute requiring unredacted bank account numbers to be provided to members of the public. I'm just curious, is there a reason CPA hasn't pursued a legislative fix previously?
I don't know of one personally, yet I can try and find out, but I don't know of any specific reason, no.
Thank you, appreciate that. Any other public comment? All right, hearing and seeing none, I'm going to move approval of item 7 as proposed by staff. And I'm sorry, excuse me, I'm actually moving approval of item 6 as proposed by staff with the addition that we delay the effective date of the regulations to January 1st, 2024, with an understanding that in November, the commission will consider whether it wants to sponsor legislation to change the statute to not allow public disclosure of bank account information. Do I have a second?
Second.
Ms. Linker, please call the roll.
Before we vote, can we just make sure the record's clear? Because if we're going to do that, we need to change a couple spots in the regulation where we're saying people need to file by a certain date.
Yes. Go ahead and put whatever clarification you want on the record.
So if we're going to delay the effective date to January 1st, 2024, we would have to change the grace period date of July 1st, 2023 to July 1st, 2024. And then it's sub A7 in the regulation draft. Line 22 on page 1, and then line 1 on page 2. And then also it would be for committees existing prior to January 1st, 2024 on page 1, line 21.
Can I ask a question about that?
Go ahead.
And it may need to be for committees existing prior to January 1st, 2024, that changed. You know, I'm aware of committees that would exist prior to. Do we need to change that date?
I do believe we would need to change that date if we're delaying the effective date of the regulation, because the grace period is to prevent too many people filing at one time.
Okay.
And so if the regulation is going into effect January 1st, 2024, we would want to grab the committees that are existing up until the effective date, who would have that grace period.
Got it. And with that, and we'd still have the provision, if I'm remembering it correctly, the next time somebody files, well, no, because this is a 410 that we're thinking of. So I'm just thinking of a committee could already exist by then to which that should apply. I guess that's where I'm getting, because you have 4-year Senate seats or, I don't know, gubernatorial seats, whatever. So I'm trying to make this more complicated, but I could see also leaving that date. I don't feel strongly about it either way, but I just want to make sure we think that date through, because we want to capture the committees that we want to capture. That would be up on the, presumably on a ballot at some time in the coming up future. And look at me, I'm not proposing a solution. So I invite any other discussion from General Counsel or others on this.
Yeah, I would agree with what Caitlin said, that we should change both dates to 2024. That way, when this goes into effect, it will start, and any committees that existed prior to then will need to amend either within 6 months or when they amend for some other reason. And any existing or any committees that are formed after that will be required to put it on their initial 410.
Thank you.
So we have a motion, we have a second, we have a clarification of the motion. Ms. Linker, would you please call the roll?
Commissioner Baker?
Aye.
Commissioner Gomez?
Aye.
Commissioner Wilson?
Aye.
Commissioner Wood?
Aye.
Chair Matich?
Aye.
The motion passes.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Chief Shaw. Thank you, Ms. Pieta-Orek.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
your work. All right, we'll now proceed to item 7. This is adoption of proposed amendments to regulation 18531.5 relating to recall elections. And with us is Senior Commission Counsel Erica Boyd. Good morning, Ms. Boyd.
Good morning, Chair and Commissioners. Welcome, Commissioner Gomez. Happy to have you here. Let me get set up. Okay, so here today to discuss adopting the proposed amendments to Regulation 18531.5 pertaining to recall elections. We were last here in August with proposed language. This is trying to codify advice that was provided in regard to the gubernatorial and other local recalls in 2021. We're addressing the narrow issue of clarifying the reporting requirements in a recall election, not the entire recall election process itself. As a quick refresher, on a recall ballot, there are 2 parts. The first question is, should the elected official, who we'll refer to as the target officer, be removed from office? This is a straight up or down question. Individuals vote yes or no. And so in that way, it's more akin to a ballot measure initiative. It qualifies for the ballot through a signature gathering process like other measures, and a recall is defined as a measure under the Act. If the recall succeeds, the second part of the ballot is selecting a replacement candidate to fill that vacancy, and that is a candidate election. Pursuant to state law, in the Constitution and the Elections Code, the target office holder cannot be a replacement candidate on the same recall ballot. So for election purposes, they're not considered a candidate at the time of the recall. They've already been elected. They are the current office holder for that position. And the Act specifically permits the office holder to control a separate committee to oppose the recall that is considered a ballot measure committee. Section 85315 governing these committees specifies that this committee is not subject to limits either, as other ballot measure committees are not subject to limits. It is not a candidate campaign committee. But given this hybrid nature of recall elections, having both aspects of a ballot measure election and a candidate election, it doesn't fit squarely into either of the boxes we have. And so as a result of that, we get many, many questions as to both the target office holders' filing obligations and the filing obligations of replacement candidates as well. It's clear from that standpoint that the current statutory language wasn't really written with recalls in mind, and that's because, again, of their intermittent nature. We don't see them every year, twice a year, 3 times a year like we see the other types of elections that are set. And so the questions come up not as frequently, and it doesn't fit into any of the really structures we have in place. Since I was here in August, there have been 2 changes made to the amendments. Both pertain to the termination of a target officer recall committee. They are highlighted in the draft regulation included with the agenda, and I will discuss them more in depth momentarily. The draft amendments were noticed for public comment. No public comments have been received to date. Additionally, staff and education division held a training with approximately 100 city clerks, and the proposed amendments were discussed. Clerks were invited to give feedback. We haven't received any feedback. And then we also undertook personal outreach to members of the regulated community and others in regard to the proposed amendments. So after this public comment and outreach period, the following parts of the proposed amendments does not receive any comment or changes. First, setting the voluntary expenditure ceiling limit for replacement candidates at the general election limit. Second, specifying that a target officer of a recall is not required to file a statement of economic interests. And third, clarifying which disclosures are required on recall and replacement candidate advertisements. I wanted to pause there to see if there are any questions from commissioners about those 3 points. I'll go to the next 2 after that.
Okay, questions from Ms. Boyd?
I'll wait and see if my question is asked.
Questions? Commissioner Wood, any questions at this point? All right, keep going, Ms. Boyd.
Okay. In regard to the changes that were made, this pertains to the termination of a target officer recall committee. Again, going to section 85315, this is what permits a target officer to set up that recall committee. From the language in the statute, it's clear that these committees should be shut down as soon as possible after the election, but there is no time frame for doing so. It does specify that any funds on hand become surplus and must be expended within 30 days, but there was no time frame connected to actual closure of the committee. When we brought our draft amendments in August, we also did not have a time frame, and the commission requested that we gather feedback as to including one. For reference, other state candidate election committees have to be closed out within 24 months of the candidate either being defeated or leaving office, while there is no timeline for closure for other ballot measure committees. So we spoke with some stakeholders and the regulated committee and others, regulated community and others, and it appears that 12 months is a realistic time frame for both receiving all invoices that might need to be paid and also receiving any refunds that might be coming from the committee. You know, we looked at a bunch of different time frames, 6 months, 12 months, 24 months. We were thinking, 24 is too long given that the statute shows this intent to clear out. 6 might be a little too short because we did see instances of people receiving refunds after that 6-month time frame. So really we think 12 months is hoping the sweet spot for everything to be included and these committees to be able to include all of the activity on their statements and close out and not have to have anything disclosed after that. We subsequently then consulted with the Franchise Tax Board, who is charged with conducting the mandatory audits of these committees to get their feedback on the 12-month time frame, and they indicated that that would not interfere with their ability to conduct their audits, and indeed they preferred that all the activity of the committee be concluded before they begin their audit so that they don't have to worry about ongoing expenditures or money being taken in after they start the audit. So with that in mind, staff is recommending a 12-month time frame for termination of these committees. The second thing that was added in that section is the inclusion of 12 months of a failure of a recall petition to qualify for the ballot. In talking to local elections officials, their most frequent comment was that they get a lot of recall efforts that don't qualify for the ballot. And so 85315 specifically allows the target office holder to set up a committee once they receive notice of the intention to recall. So it hasn't yet qualified, but people are going to go out and start collecting signatures. So in that case, even if it doesn't qualify, these committees they set up would still need to be closed out within 12 months of the petition failing to qualify for the ballot. So we added that term, failure of a recall petition, to the draft language, and this also comports with the statutory language in 85315. Any questions on that part?
Hearing and seeing none, please continue.
Seeing none. Moving on. The final area we wanted to address was the pre-election reports. There had been some questions at the last commission meeting that we wanted to look into further. As a refresher here, candidates who are up for election file pre-election reports, which is 2 elections prior to the election, in regard to their candidate election committee and any other of their controlled committees on the same timeline as their election committee. So if Mr. Wilson is running for Senate in November 2022, he also has a ballot measure committee and an office holder committee open, he would file pre-election reports for all of those committees at the same time he files for his election committee. Separate from that, there's a requirement for primarily formed ballot measure committees in support or opposition of a ballot measure to file pre-election reports. Now, a candidate who has a primarily formed ballot measure committee that's going to be having a measure on the upcoming ballot does not have the same requirement to file all of their controlled committees at the same time. It was noted that this appears to be a bit of potentially disparate treatment. We went back and took another look at the language in both the Constitution and the pre-election reporting requirements. The Constitution, Article 2, Section 15, specifically sets up a two-part ballot question. And the first question is whether the target officer is being recalled. And again, a recall is specifically defined as a measure under the Act. So in that respect, the person who's the target office holder is not a candidate for election on that ballot. And we consistently treat their committee as a ballot measure committee in line with both the language included in the Constitution, the other areas that it's defined within the Act, and the pre-election reporting requirements. Distinctly, replacement candidates are candidates on the ballot on that second part of the question. And so their other controlled committees are treated the same as any other candidate up for election. They have to file on the same timeline for the pre-election reporting. We were specifically asked if the Constitution would prohibit or permit us to require pre-election reports of the target office holder. To be very clear, the Constitution doesn't speak to pre-election reporting. That is included within the statute. And as the statute is currently written, we don't see a way that the language could bear an interpretation of requiring the target office holders' other committees to file at this time. This is not to say that the statute couldn't be changed. If it was changed to say that, a target office holder with a committee open under 85315 must file for their other controlled committees at the same time, that would fully comport with the language in the Constitution, and we would be able to require it. But at this time, we don't think that the language bears an interpretation separate from what we've determined.
Any questions? Commissioner Wilson?
Thank you for the detailed presentation. I kind of have a technical question. Without you getting into anything specific, are there any proposed statutory changes that are in the works or being considered, or is that something that's still up in the air?
We don't have any as of right now. We're happy to draft the language if the commission would like to do that. And I believe we've noted it's going to be at the November meeting. We'll be discussing that more in depth, but we can definitely draw up language suggesting that
Other
change.
than news reports, has there been any indication that the legislature is considering any?
Nothing that I know of. I don't know if anybody is here yet.
Well, you guys would be the first to know.
We would
So.
call us immediately. No, I have not heard of anybody.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Well, can I just, unless I'm mistaken on this point, I believe the legislature did have hearings last year, or maybe earlier this year. I'm losing track of time these days. They recently held hearings on the recall process, and there was no action after those hearings. So one could look at that and say that there's no current legislative effort from the building, at least, to change the recall rules. I just wanted to make that observation. Other commissioners have any? Commissioner Baker?
Thank you. First of all, thank you for a very rational and logical presentation, and very clear, both in the memos and in August. And I'd like to have a couple of questions, and I also want to say I appreciate you addressing what I had asked in August, which was, is there this last point you made about what does the Constitution say, what does the statute say? But I'm going to walk back a little bit into it. So you mentioned with respect to pre-election reports and candidate-controlled committees, that they right now do have to file pre-election reports and 24-hour or late filing reports, as they're called. I'm teeing this up a little bit. So how would you describe why? Why is that a requirement? Why is that important? Other than the fact that it's in the law, what is the rationale for requiring those reports to happen?
As far as I know, it was intended to provide the public with a better understanding of who's giving to all of a potential officer's committees at that time. And so it is in both the statute and the regulation. In looking at that, though, the same could be said that if they had intended for all of an officer's committees to be filed with their recall committee, that could have been put into the statute as well.
Yeah.
So in this instance, I think there's a clear, at least intent, that only in the case of when the person is up for election would their other control committees file.
Yeah.
There's also the argument to be made that in a candidate election, you're receiving funds subject to limits into your election committee, while in a recall situation, there are no limits on the amount that can be given to a target office holder's recall committee. So in that respect, there's less incentive for someone to give to their other committees if they're trying to influence the person who's being recalled. The person, it'd be there are a lot more steps if you're giving to other committees to then move it to the recall committee, even if you could, instead of just giving a lump sum amount as much as you want to the recall to, let this target office holder know that you're supporting them in that respect.
Well, thank you. And on that last point, I do see that reasoning, and it makes sense to me. I can also imagine, a very concrete way, where a donor wants to show support for the target officer without also giving directly to the opposition recall measure or committee. I'm probably going to confuse language here. And so they may give to another committee that is controlled by that individual. Perhaps they're reelected, that may be coming up down the road or some other time, because they don't want the public image of opposing the recall or supporting the person who's targeted. They have shareholders, all kinds of things. So I do imagine a scenario where they would choose that for all the various optics that can happen. That's a pretty finite point. The next question is, if we can just, I need a little bit more grounding in the Constitution before I make my proposal for what we do. And I've heard you both in August and here. The Constitution is clear that on the second question that comes up to voters in a recall, who's going to replace the target officer? The Constitution is pretty explicit that the target officer cannot be a candidate. So there's no ambiguity there. It's on that first question about should this individual be removed from office that the Constitution is not as explicit. First of all, am I right about that?
The recall is defined as a measure, but that definition
in the Constitution?
Within the Act.
Right.
So I'll read from the Constitution. If the majority vote on the question is to recall, the officer is removed. So our interpretation of this specific phrase comes from the definitions included within the Act.
Okay.
So if the recall is defined as a measure, then we treat it as a ballot measure committee. Again, it's not subject to limits specifically under 85315, and that the target officer is not a candidate.
And just for the benefit of the public, but also me, when we're saying that it's in the Act, does that also mean that it's in the Constitution?
No, that's
Okay.
the government code.
So that's where where I'm getting the answer that I think I heard you earlier today, as well as August, that on that first question, the Constitution is
Correct.
not explicit on it. Okay.
Right.
And I think, look, I feel that on these questions of the pre-election reports, and including the late reporting ones, that we've reached a long-standing conclusion, this agency and perhaps everybody else in the universe, that I don't quite reach from constitutional language, that the target officer for purpose of the first question is a measure and not a candidate. I understand it's explicit on the second question, but the first question, I haven't gotten there yet. Certainly the question of should this person be removed is an up or down point, just like a ballot measure. The question gets before a voter in the similar way as a ballot measure. You got to get signatures and so on. But in so many other ways, that target officer is much more akin to a candidate world. It's an individual, whether they should hold an office. And someone who, will continue to be in office if they're not recalled and make either votes or decisions, as opposed to a ballot measure. It's thumbs up or thumbs down on a policy, and that's it. It's the question is done. And when I think about the goal of more transparency, knowing before an election who's contributing to whom and how money is being spent on behalf of whom, I think it's much more consistent, certainly with the spirit of what Californians did with the PRA, to treat the target officer as a candidate. And I don't find contrary language in the Constitution. I haven't found that yet. For my part, I would therefore not further enshrine the conclusion that is reached, that target officer is a measure. And I would actually have us advocate to change at least the statute so that we are bringing about more transparency about spending related to a target officer on the first question. That's a conclusion I have reached. And I'm open to any language in this Constitution that says, Catherine, you are wrong. We're telling you to do it this way. But that's the conclusion that I reach, both the spirit of the act and the logic and how a target officer question is much more like a candidate election.
You're the chair.
Well, you do. All right. Well, I appreciate my colleagues' perspective on this issue. And I will just say, I think as an overarching policy question, if we had a magic wand and we always wanted to improve transparency, certainly requiring the pre-election reports of everybody does advance transparency. I think that is true as a matter of policy and as preference, and I share that. The question as to whether or not there is other indicia of intent in the Constitution for treating the target of a recall as analogous to a measure, as the Act does, so consistent with the Constitution, or whether they should be treated as a candidate. I'm reminded of the Roberti advice letter, which was, as I understand it, the first time back in 1989 when this agency was asked whether campaign contribution limits would apply to a target official in the context of a recall. And if memory serves, the analysis that we gave more than 30 years ago identified another provision in the Constitution that supports the understanding that a recall is a measure, the target official at least is part of a measure and not a candidate. And that is because the recall provisions also require that the state actually pay a candidate for the cost of a recall in the event that the candidate fends off the recall. And the Act, which the voters adopted subsequent to the constitutional change, but we tend to analyze these things to harmonize them, the Act says that candidates cannot receive public funds for purposes of an election. And so when you look, I think we looked more than 30 years ago at that, and in harmonizing those various aspects, including what the voters adopted in 1974, including the voters saying that a recall is part of a measure, that we advise that no, target officials are not subject to candidate contribution limits because they are akin to a measure. The voters subsequent to that had another opportunity to amend the Act to change that outcome if that was not preferable. That occurred when Prop 34 came into place. There were candidate contributions put in place. There were no changes to the language with respect to recalls being considered a measure. There's no effort, of course, at that point to impose contribution limits on the target official because they are considered a ballot measure. Citizens Against Rent Control had already been decided by the Supreme Court. So the lay of the land had already been set there. So to me, when we're talking about this, we may not like the law as it reads today. And I don't disagree that perhaps there could be a legislative effort to change it. But I don't see it as enshrining something that we think is wrong. I think that's the wrong way of looking at it. I think the correct way of looking at it is we have an obligation as an administrative agency. We have a duty to set aside our personal preferences and instead to enact regulations that are consistent with the statutes. And here, for more than 30 years, we've understood the statutes to mean something. The voters have never questioned that. There's been no legal challenge to that interpretation. This is mechanical. This is taking our advice and putting it in our regulations so it's there, and nothing about that forecloses future legislative changes. So that's kind of my piece on it. I do appreciate your perspective. I agree. I wish that it was required. It's just not today, and there's nothing we can do today to change that.
Thank you. And I appreciate the Roberti letter as well from 1989. We were both young, which is great. Younger. Thank you. Younger. Comparative. And I wholeheartedly agree that what we want to do should not be a matter of personal preference, and that it should be very rarely done that if we've had a long-standing interpretation that we should take a different course. I see the language in the Constitution that's quoted in the Roberti advice letter from 1989 that a state officer, target officer, shall be reimbursed if the recall fails, which, by the way, I had no idea. That was a new provision I was not aware of. I guess where I'm still having a difficult time, even with the timeline you've done, is saying that therefore, I mean, recalls are different. And the Constitution isn't as explicit on the first question, and it is explicit on the second question. And there are statutory and constitutional interpretation principles of if you're going to be explicit about one but not the other, there's something to be said there. I think up to this point, this agency, and again, perhaps many others, have determined that that means treat it as a ballot measure instead of a candidate. And I'm finding because of how similar the target officer is to an election for a specific office, all the need to know when someone's potentially being influenced by a contribution, that a particular individual is involved, that they're being asked whether they're going to get to keep a seat as opposed to a policy change. All those points lead me to the same interpretive principles going the other way. And I hope where we land on this, regardless of today's measures, is that we would be encouraging the legislature to be explicit on this. So thank you. And I thank the chair for providing the Roberti advice letter. This is very good legal research.
Thanks.
And you've got the skill.
Appreciate that, Commissioner Wilson.
Well, thank you, Commissioner Baker. The chair and vice chair, I think, made some excellent points, but there's longstanding precedent. It's based on, the detailed information that's been provided by the staff and also the Roberti advice letter, that a targeted officer is not a candidate, but treated more like a ballot measure. And to argue the other side of it, if I'm a candidate and I just ran for office and I got elected with 50, 60% of the vote, or even with 51% of the vote, that's when I was a candidate. And the way that the recall laws are written in this state, you can go after someone and file a recall petition without even making the argument that individual is not doing their job as an elected official. You don't have to justify it as long as you can meet the various thresholds without getting into all those details. So I respectfully disagree with the argument that, well, the law should necessarily be changed. And if it's going to be changed, it should be done through the legislature or through a ballot initiative adopted by the voters. I don't think that the FPPC should be defining what a recall measure is relative to a candidate without more explicit direction from either the voters or the legislature.
Thank you, Commissioner Wilson. Commissioner Wood, questions, comments?
A thought I had during this conversation was that the current setup is kind of interesting politically because it's a little bit of a rejection of the recall process in that it allows this big asymmetry between the target officer and the people trying for the recall who have almost no obstacles to doing that except for getting the signatures. And so anyway, I just had that kind of reflection almost on an academic point, but disturbing that would probably be pretty, it would probably cause a bit of an earthquake, not the kind we're used to, but a new kind. So I'm okay hanging out with what we have right now.
Thank you, Commissioner Wood. Commissioner Gomez, anything to add? What?
No, I appreciate the great input from colleagues and also all of which I think are logical and rational, and everyone's made good substantive points. And for my part, I certainly support some of the regulations that are here today. I may encourage a separate vote, so I can just say that on the point about pre-election reporting, late reporting, and I think it's the voluntary contribution limits, the other one that I would expenditure limits. Thank you. I would not further put them in our regulations. I would first seek a change from the legislature, and that will be my point. But I thank my colleagues for the good discussion.
Can I ask a question about that though? Sorry, I can't see everybody.
Yeah, go ahead, Commissioner Wood. You're up.
Oh no, I can't. Why, Commissioner Baker? I'm really interested in hearing your thoughts on why you wouldn't approve the voluntary expenditure limits.
Well, maybe I'm thinking of more the pre-election reports, but there's similar reasoning in the voluntary expenditure limits. But so that's the one where we're trying to do the general election. Yeah, no, that one makes sense to me. And I think there's in both that proposed regulation and the SEI regulation, there's a different defining principle and rationale that is consistent with both the Constitution and that rationale. With SEI, they already have one that they've done in less than a year. So that makes sense to me. And on the contribution, I keep using the wrong terminology, expenditure limits. That has again, that makes sense in your point in your memo. It's the reporting and the transparency of information, which again rests almost exclusively on the conclusion that a target officer is not a candidate, which I guess I've made my point that I reach a different conclusion, and based on the law that's before me. So thank you, Commissioner Wood, for nailing me down on more precision on that.
Thanks for your explanation.
All right, so just for my sake, for understanding then, Commissioner Baker, it is proposed amendments to regulation 18531.5. They're combined. There's multiple amendments to that regulation, aren't there? I was trying to figure out what I'm trying to do is sort out how we vote for this, how we break it up. Mr. Bainbridge, putting you on the spot. Any thoughts on how we pull out the change that Commissioner Baker wishes to pull out and then vote separately on everything else?
Well, I think we'd have to have proposed alternative language and vote on it as a proposed amendment to what has been proposed here. And then if that is adopted, then you would vote on the entire thing. So we would need some language, I think, to be able to do it.
To amend this to change what staff is proposing with respect to pre-election and late contribution reports. And we would vote on that amendment and then move forward from there. Is that what you're saying?
Correct.
So then we would have a separate vote on that question.
Or you could vote on them as proposed.
Yeah. Go ahead.
And this is more of a technical question. I would agree on the procedural advice, the general counsel and chair have articulated. But my question would be, is there any requirement based on your experience and advice that the proposed amendment by Commissioner Baker would have to be in writing? Is it something that traditionally our precedent would be it has to be in writing, or can it be voted on if her proposed amendment is clearly understood by the public and the other members of the FPPC?
It can be done orally on the record. Our general practice is if it's something simple like we saw with the last regulation of changing a year, we do it orally. If it's a more complicated issue, in order to make sure we are clear on what we're voting on, I would recommend having it put in writing before we vote on it. If the commission feels comfortable that they all understand what the proposed changes are, even if just stated orally on the record, that's sufficient for purposes of approving the reg as amended. But it's just sort of a practical, can we understand what we're voting on is really the question. And sometimes it gets too convoluted to do it orally.
I would defer to you and the commission to determine whether it's complicated or not. So.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, Commissioner Wood.
Maybe I'm wrong about this and y'all can tell me, but on page 2, subpart, it looks like C1, target officer. I think, Commissioner Baker, if we were to break just that vote out, it might solve the issue. And I don't think there's any cross references inside of it that in the rest of the regulation that refer back to it. So that might be a simple way to break it out, rather than have to deal with the alternative text and coming back in another month or whatever.
I think you're right with the one exception. I think the language that we would have the separate vote on is on lines 15 through 20. There's another change at line 22 of that same section on page 2 that I don't think, Commissioner Baker, is the topic of your
Correct.
concern.
Correct.
So it's just between lines 15 and 20, if I'm understanding correctly.
And I'm flipping through, and thanks, colleagues, for bothering me. But I appreciate the indulgence. I agree that certainly if I would make, and I can ask Mr. Bainbridge if he sees it on page 2, if I were to move to strike from line 15 to 20, the underlined text, if that accomplishes what I'm trying to accomplish, which is to not have the regulations for pre-election reports and late filing reports be treated like a measure. If that does it there.
So if we did that, we would then be silent on the question of whether candidates or, there we go, target officers would have to file pre-elections for their other controlled committees. So they would not become, we would not have an affirmative statement that they are required in a regulation.
We'd have we'd have our advice that's been previously done. Sorry. And this is probably not going to pass.
Well, I mean, regardless of that, Mr. Bainbridge, unless I'm mistaken, I think Ms. Boyd told us that the statute wouldn't allow us to put that in the regulation anyway. So we couldn't, it would be silent because we couldn't answer the question any other way today other than the way we proposed answering it, is how I'm thinking about it. Is that right?
Yeah, I think based on our interpretation, yeah, though. So I think this would accomplish, it sounds like now I understand what Commissioner Baker's purpose would be. So I think that would accomplish it in that we would not have made a decision one way or the other in regulation on the filings.
Correct. Okay.
I believe that does it. Because if my goal is that pre-election report and late contribution reports, that we are not adopting the proposed amendments. And that's all that I would be saying. That the way to accomplish that is page 2, strike the proposed language between lines 15 and 20. Okay, that is my motion to strike from the proposed regulations, page 2, lines 15 through 20.
The proposed changes identified. on
Yes, the underlined text, the proposed changes.
that. As a courtesy, I'll second the motion.
Thank you.
And just for clarification, I think we all know the answer to this. This is a main motion subject to adoption, and the vote requirement would be what in this case?
The motion as made would be proposing that you adopt the regulations as suggested to be amended by Commissioner Baker.
Right. As opposed to a motion to amend a main motion. Okay, thank you for the clarification.
All right. Is there any public comment at this time? Is there any public comment? Hearing and seeing none. Ms. Linker, would you call the roll
Commissioner Baker,
on Commissioner Baker's motion?
Aye.
Commissioner Gomez, Commissioner Wilson,
Not voting.
Commissioner Wood,
Not voting.
Chair Matich.
I'm going to vote no. So the motion does not pass. Is that correct?
Correct. There was no quorum.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. So at this time, unless there's further discussion amongst the commission, I would move adoption of proposed amendments to regulation 18531.5 as proposed by staff.
Oh. Can I be recognized?
You certainly.
If I can do that in the middle of a motion.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah,
You can always talk after. If there's a second, we could get the second and then have more discussion.
Okay.
so is there a second?
I
For my
can
motion.
second.
All right, Commissioner Baker.
Thank you. I do wish to support the other provisions. The SEI and the other proposed regulations. Is there a way for me to do that?
Why don't we just note it as part of the record, because we cannot, we've been advised we cannot bifurcate the vote at this point. We've had a motion to amend the staff proposal. That motion has failed. And so now on the table is staff's recommendations as presented.
Because we can't bifurcate.
Correct.
Okay, I think I know what I'll do. Thank you.
All right. Ms. Linker.
Commissioner Baker,
Abstain.
Commissioner Gomez,
Aye.
Commissioner Wilson,
Aye.
Commissioner Wood,
Aye.
Chair Matich.
Aye.
The motion passes.
Thank you, Ms. Boyd. Great work on the research and answering our questions. Thank you, Commissioner Baker. A spirited discussion.
Well, I thank my
Excellent
colleagues
Excellent
and the
points.
chair and all and everyone for allowing that. We don't often go through the grind of it, but I'm very grateful for it.
All right, moving on to item 8. This is an informational presentation by General Counsel Bainbridge on the various ways in which we provide advice to interested parties. And he has a PowerPoint for us, as I understand.
I do. I have a recycled PowerPoint. It's a presentation I've given to, I forget which group it was, but one group in the public, providing them information about the FPPC's advice functions and how they could obtain advice and what advice is really there for. So when I was asked to do this, I thought I can reuse some work I've already done. So if you have questions as I go along, feel free to jump in, or at the end, that's fine. It's not a real long presentation. Just wanted to give you some idea about the different advice functions that we have, and let's see, that's the wrong slideshow. I'm not doing that slideshow. Well, I'll give my little preamble here while they work on that. So we have 3 main types of advice that we give. One is by letter, the written letter, which we call formal advice. That's the one you get the report on once a month, and I think that's the one people are most familiar with. We also have what we call informal assistance, which is done by both email and on our telephone line. The vast majority of the advice we give is given through one of these 2 means, as opposed to the advice letters where we issue somewhere between maybe 5 to 10 a month. We have thousands of calls and emails that we get every month from people wondering about the requirements under the Act and how they comply with the Act. Still waiting. Okay, I'll fill. So when we talk about the advice function, there we go. Something to keep in mind is the purpose of it is to inform people who are subject to the Act on what the requirements are for them to comply with the Act. It's not intended as, and it's sometimes thought of this way, but it's not intended this way, that it is us saying this is precisely what the law is. It's us saying this is what you need to do to follow the law. And this is kind of you kind of go, what's the difference? The difference is sometimes there is some question or there's some gray area in the law. When that happens, our advice function is to make sure they're complying with the law. So we say we give conservative advice in those circumstances. That's not like liberal, conservative, that sort of thing. It's the advice we give, we're going to err on the side of telling you maybe you can't do something or you need to report something, even if it's a questionable issue, because we want to make sure you're complying with the law. So I think that the example we get very often, especially in formal advice, is a conflict case involving, typically it's real estate, often it's someone's house, and whether they can vote on a matter involving their own property. And we have different parameters. If you're within 500 feet, you probably can't. If you're between 500 and 1,000, maybe. And then over 1,000, it's usually you can. is basically, I'm summarizing the standard. So we have questions, I'm 700 feet away. Is this thing I may be voting on as a city council member, is that likely to affect the value of my home? And this can often be a very difficult question. One, we're not real estate appraisers. Two, I don't always trust real estate appraisers. So we have to it's our best guess. And when in doubt, we would err on the side of saying, well, you may have a conflict of interest here, so you should abstain from voting. That's the way to ensure that you're not going to violate the law. All right, so there's the three types of advice. The other thing that I hadn't mentioned yet is commission opinions. So we'll get into each of these a little bit more. We'll start with the formal advice. I guess the other point I would like to make is that we're not the legal counsel to the requester. We're not substituting for an attorney for them. Our role is to tell them what the law requires of them to do to ensure that they're complying with the law. And I'll probably say that maybe 4 more times during the presentation. We can count. Okay, so starting with formal advice. Formal advice are the letters that we send out. We were talking about one from 1989 earlier today, so we've been doing it for a long time. They're provided for in the government code, both for questions about the act as well as questions about Government Code 1090, conflicts of interest emanating from contracts. They provide immunity from administrative enforcement actions, so our internal enforcement actions. What this means is if someone seeks advice from us, we provide advice based on the facts they've given, they follow that advice, they would be immune from prosecution by our enforcement division. Some caveats there that you may have caught, it's if they give us all the facts and they follow what we say based on the facts they've provided. If they go outside of the facts or they don't provide facts, then there is no immunity that attaches. Formal advice, 21 working days for us to respond internally, which can be a very short turnaround on some complicated questions. So occasionally we don't make that deadline, but we're pretty good at getting things done within 21 days. And then there's a long regulation. I don't believe anyone, maybe Commissioner Wilson was on the commission when we redid that reg not too long ago, lays out when we give advice, when we don't give advice, what sort of advice may be appropriate in different circumstances. So I just include that citation there if people are interested in getting in the nitty gritty of formal advice versus informal.
Mr. Bainbridge, can I ask a clarifying question on formal advice? So you mentioned a moment ago that it provides immunity from an administrative enforcement action. You also mentioned that essentially only extends as far as we have all the relevant material facts at the time you render the advice. If somebody has a formal advice letter and somebody files a complaint against them, is there any bar to enforcement investigating to ensure compliance with that formal advice letter that was given out?
No, if there's questions about whether the facts match what are in the letter. So the facts have to be the same as the letter for the letter to provide immunity.
Okay.
And the facts are as provided to us. We don't do any sort of fact finding. We wouldn't bury our head in the sand if something was clearly not accurate in what is provided in the facts. But in order for the advice process to work, we have to go on the facts that they provide for us, and then we provide them instruction on how, based on those facts, they can comply with the law.
So your advice is predicated on the material facts that are provided by the requester, which is not to say there could be other material facts in existence that weren't provided to us. Is that?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And on occasion, we may get a question and we may know additional information, because it's a jurisdiction we're familiar with. In which case, we wouldn't include that information in the letter before going back to the requester and saying, is this information accurate, or we need more information about this particular issue. It's very common that we get a request and we have to go back multiple times to the requester to get additional information to allow us to fully respond to their advice request.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that clarification. Commissioner Baker?
I think my question is in follow-up or in understanding that. And it's the legal effect of your advice letter for when a complaint is filed for our own team. So is there let's say in the fact pattern that the chair has put forward that somebody seeks advice our team renders formal advice letter, and then later somebody else files a complaint against those folks, that implicates the questions that were raised in the formal advice letter, does that advice letter have any binding effect on the actions that our enforcement team takes? Are there any presumptions about it when a complaint comes in that contradicts the facts in the letter? Any legal effect, presumptions, or deference that needs to be given to the advice letter?
The legal effect is that they would have immunity based on the facts that are in the letter. Presumptions, no.
Okay. And so our team would the intake who's receiving whatever the complaint is it, they're not bound to presume that the facts that are in an advice letter are happening as opposed to what's alleged in the complaint. They're not bound by the assumption of facts in the advice letter. I'm not asking this very well, but I'm trying to see if there's any, if an advice letter has gone to the questions that the complaint raises, but the facts, do our enforcement team have to assume that the facts matched what was in the advice letter that gives them the immunity?
No, and it's probably a good time to point out that we have to be asked the question in advance of any of these events happening. So we can't give advice if something has already occurred. So can I vote on this project that's coming up? If you've already taken action on a different phase of the project, we won't give advice on that because you've already taken an action that you're asking about. Mm-hmm. More simply put, sometimes people will write in and say, I got this gift and I didn't report it, but I didn't have to, right? And
can you bless this, please?
Yes, it's basically that. So we would not give advice in that circumstance. Mm-hmm. We only give advice prior to events happening. So they have to ask in advance.
That's a great point, going a little bit different, I think, than what I was trying to inartfully ask, which is, again, if the legal questions that are posed in the advice letter are the same as a complaint, but the facts in the complaint are different than what was in the advice letter, that advice letter doesn't bind our intake team to determine that everything's okay or everything's not okay because there's an existence of an advice letter.
Right. There'd be there's no effect of what our advice letter says on what actually may have happened, and it wouldn't impact how enforcement would consider the case, other than to know that there's an advice letter out there that says, if you follow these facts, then you have immunity.
Okay. That is an answer to my question. Thank you.
Commissioner Wilson?
Go ahead. Yeah. Commissioner Baker's question and your response kind of answered some of the questions I have, so thank you both. But when it comes to advice letters versus email advice, it's my understanding that advice letters are public information. But in terms of email advice, let's say an official contacts you, you send them an email. If they don't make it public, is that information at any point subject to a subpoena, subject to open records request? Is there any way that anybody can get access to that email advice, even if they know it exists, but they don't have a copy of it?
Yes, they could make a request to us, and it's a public record.
Okay, that's why I just wanted clarification on it. Okay, yeah. Thank you.
Commissioner Wood, any questions before we move on to the next slide?
Well, now I have one. On the email advice, why are we not, if it counts as formal advice, shouldn't we publish it also along with the other kind of formal advice we're providing? Or is it, did I misunderstand it? It's all only available by request?
Email advice is not formal advice. It's considered informal assistance.
Oh, okay. Okay, thanks.
Now I'm all thrown off. Yes, I covered all of that slide and more. All right, so in order to obtain formal advice, there's a few requirements taken from the statute as well as our regulations. It has to be from an official or their authorized representative regarding the official's duties in order to get formal advice. So someone can't write in and say, can assembly member so-and-so accept this gift? It has to be the assembly member or their authorized representative writing in and asking for it. Again, back to the goal. This will be number one of the 4. We're giving them advice on how to comply with the law. We're not allowing them to tattle on someone who's their opponent or even just because they're curious. The goal is to provide people with the information they need to follow the law. As we've discussed already, advice is based on facts provided. In fact, even in our advice letters, that's how it's identified, as facts provided by the requester. And we assume they're accurate unless we know otherwise. So it's not an adjudicatory process. It's not a fact-finding process. It's we take the facts as provided and apply them to the law and then advise on compliance with the law. As I mentioned, we're not going to give any advice on prior conduct or anything that is currently subject to an enforcement action. So we have an internal process of knowing what is subject to an enforcement action, and we won't provide any advice on those sort of questions. And then we also want specific questions so that we can give a specific answer. The general or hypothetical questions we typically won't respond to because that can lead to inaccurate advice. We need specific facts on which to provide the advice. There are some instances where we will issue informal advice via letter, which is someone wants a formal letter, but they aren't providing a specific decision or a specific scenario for us to be able to give formal advice on where immunity could attach, but we believe it's an important enough situation where we will issue what we call an I letter, which does not provide immunity, is technically informal, but other than that, it looks like an advice letter. The most common circumstance where you'll see that is with the revolving door provisions. So when an official leaves office, they often want to know, hey, I'm going to work for this private company. What can and can't I do? So that's where you'll often see advice letters where the rules are written such that it depends on what the specific work is that they're doing, whether that would violate the revolving door provisions. And they don't actually know what maybe what projects they'll be working on with their new employment. So we'll give them some general guidance on if it's this, then you can't participate in it. But most of the advice letters you'll see will be formal advice letters, not the informal advice letters. But just thought I'd mention that. That's kind of the one exception where something written on our letterhead isn't considered formal advice. And then an area where we have areas of unsettled law that are subject to multiple interpretations. These are kicked over to the opinion realm. This is because if the answer is not clear, it's the role of the commission to issue an opinion. Opinions are issued by the commission after a vote. They have a little more gravitas than an advice letter that comes directly from commission staff. So in circumstances where we get an advice request that we think falls into this category, common example would be new legislation. How should this provision of this new legislation be interpreted? Pursuant to our reg, the procedure for that is to instead encourage the requester to seek a commission opinion as opposed to advice, which comes directly from staff. And we'll talk about opinions a little bit more coming up. The other thing I would note is media questions. We often will get media questions. Those should be directed to Jay Waranga, who is in charge of answering questions for the media, because the media is not asking on behalf of an official. They're asking for their own knowledge, and we want to provide that information as a public service so they can do their job. But the advice function isn't the appropriate function for media to get their questions answered. They have to send them to Jay. And then also, I think the public may say, how do we get our information? Was I predicting your question? And the advice function isn't really set up for us to do that, nor do we, frankly, have the staff to be able to respond to all the public's inquiries. That's why we have trainings and materials on our websites and are constantly trying to improve our website so that interested members of the public can go to our website and try to find the information that they're looking for. So can you go back?
I think Commissioner Baker has one more question for you.
Okay.
Thank you. And that one of it was, what does the public do to get their information? And just robust. I mean, they could sign up for the advice letters are published, right? Because I think we get a monthly report of all the advice letters. They're great reading, by the way. And so the public can sign up for all those kinds of notifications. We have public emails, changes to rules, and so on. I think we've even had the public call in during public comment at the beginning of a commission meeting and say, I'm trying to find this out, and we do our best to point them in the direction. So I wanted to supplement that answer a little bit because we do try to be helpful. On the third bullet point about no prior conduct or subject of an enforcement action, do you mean by enforcement action related to that individual? Because or if someone's calling or emailing you for formal advice on something that they're not under investigation for at the moment because it's prospective, but somebody else is, you're not saying that you wouldn't give advice. Can you just clarify that point?
Yeah, correct. It's not attached to the individual. It's attached to the actions that may have created liability, the alleged violations of the act. We wouldn't advise on those actions, but it's not like if you have a campaign case and you want to call in and get advice on filing your SEI, we wouldn't give you advice on filing your SEI.
Understood. And if I may, the only other question is the I letters, are those also subject to public records request or otherwise published?
Yes, they are published as part of the advice letter report that we send out monthly.
Didn't realize those were advice letters. They sure look exactly like advice letters.
Yeah, you just have to look for the little I.
Okay, thank you.
And those are also included aren't they as part of our advice letter, the database that we have on our website?
Yes.
I thought when I was, yeah. So there are multiple ways. They're also on Lexis or on Westlaw. They're available in a number of ways.
Yep. Okay, so the sort of nuts and bolts of the issuance of formal advice. Advice letters they come in to us. Brian Lau, our Assistant General Counsel, is in charge of our advice letter program, and he receives all of them, he reviews them, and then he will assign them to attorney. He also has the task of reviewing all of them in detail and has an encyclopedic knowledge of conflicts of interest as a result of what he does. The request will come in typically by email. We encourage people to send them by email. We used to get them usually by formal letter, but it's just easier nowadays to send them in by email. So anyone who's listening, please feel free. You can write your letter on letterhead, but send it into our advice email, and that will get it processed most quickly. Once they come in, they're assigned to one of our legal division attorneys. The attorney will review them. Typically, they do an initial review to see what additional facts they think they're going to need in order to give advice. I think it's pretty common that there isn't enough facts to provide advice or they'd like more information. They'll get that from the requester, and they'll research, they'll draft the letter. We typically have three levels of review for advice letters. There's a peer review, there's a review by Mr. Lau, and then I always review them before they go out as well. Which is why 21 working days can be a little tight on some instances where they require lots of research. So they are issued without formal commission action as is intended. This is advice coming from staff. If it requires the decision of the commission, they'd be issued as an opinion. These are often confused, but the advice letters come from staff, the opinions come from the commission. They're published on our website. They're available on Lexis. They're available on Westlaw. You can use a filter so that you're just searching for our advice letters on both of the online services. They're public. The requests for advice are also public. Those aren't published as a matter of course, but if someone makes a CPRA request to us, the Public Records Act request, we will provide the request for the advice in addition to the advice that was provided. And it's, I think, important to keep in mind that these are instructive as interpretations of the law, but they do not create precedent. They have no bearing on any other party other than the party requesting the advice. So sometimes they're treated as if they're a case law that has a precedental value. They don't. They're instructive as to maybe how we would advise someone else on the law, but again, we're specific to the facts that are provided. So in that way, they're just really effective for the person who has requested them and received it. I talked too long. It doesn't want to advance anymore. Broke it. Or put it under my chin like your car. Oh, I got a thumb up. Oh boy. There we go. Okay. All right. I'm going to move on to email advice unless there are additional questions about formal at this point. Okay. So email advice is part of our informal assistance, as we call it. Most of the advice questions we get can be handled, and in my opinion, should be handled through the email function. It's a lot quicker than formal advice. You usually get a response within 24 hours. Most of the questions we get are questions we have answered before, or with a little bit of research can be responded to fairly quickly. I think if someone is unsure whether they should request formal advice or whether they just need email advice, I would encourage them to write in for email advice. If our staff feels it's something that should be elevated to the level of formal advice, we will do that. We always check with the requester and ensure they would like formal advice. But just because someone asks for email advice and we think it should be formal doesn't mean they only can get email advice, or vice versa. Occasionally we'll get a formal advice request and we'll say, we can answer this question for you in an email today. There's no reason for you to wait a few weeks to get the answer. So I just encourage members of the public, send it in via email, and then we'll figure out what the best way is to answer your question. Email advice is done by what we call PRCs, political reform consultants, who are experts in the law, but not necessarily attorneys. We also have attorneys in our legal division that assist with answering the email questions. Like I said, a lot of the times it's the same question we commonly get, so we already have the answer ready to go. Like I said, it's quicker than formal advice. Our email advice function is managed by Suki Brar, who is our other assistant general counsel, and then also Ivy Branneman, who is the manager for the PRCs in that advice division. We typically have one attorney assigned each day to assist the PRCs in providing answers. About 80% or plus, depending on how busy we are, of the email requests are responded to within 24 hours. So it really is the best way to get an answer to questions. Typically, formal advice will concern questions of conflicts of interest. I think that's the lion's share of what formal advice is. The email advice is a little more heavy into campaign and SEI questions, because again, there's rarely a novel question in those areas, and they're not as fact specific as a conflict of interest. So particularly with campaign and SEI questions, email advice is usually sufficient to get someone the answer they're looking for. As I note here, similar criteria for giving advice. It has to be someone with obligations under the act asking about themselves or the person who they're asking on behalf of. It can't be someone asking about someone else's conduct unless they're authorized. Won't give advice on things that have already happened. And if a question is too hypothetical or broad, we may not give advice. We may request that someone clarify exactly what they're asking about. We want to be as helpful as possible in assisting the public, or in officials in knowing what the requirements are and what the act requires. But we also want to make sure the advice we're giving is accurate. And if we don't have sufficient information, we don't want to give advice that's going to be inaccurate or incomplete.
I think Commissioner Wilson has
It's kind of a technical question. You know, your presentation is very detailed, but when it comes to asking for advice on behalf of a public official, can anyone that works for that public official make that call? Can a member of their campaign staff make the call? What's the scope of who can ask that question in terms of representatives of a public official?
Yeah, it's anyone who's authorized by that official to ask the question.
How do you determine if they're authorized? I mean,
Well,
if I call you up and I say I'm the chief of staff to Assembly, it's a serious question. If I call you up and say I'm the chief of staff to Assembly member so-and-so or Senator so-and-so, is that good enough, or do I need to verify that that's in fact the case?
We take people at their word typically.
Okay.
If there was reason for us to doubt it,
I can't imagine.
we might double check it, but I haven't seen that happen. We typically take people at their word that they're asking on behalf of who they.
That's very positive. Thank you.
I just had a quick question. When it comes to email advice, with multiple people, I guess, answering the emails at any given day, do we have a system or a process to audit and ensure consistency in terms of the advice that we're giving it out by email?
We do. Ivy Branneman, who I mentioned, is the manager, tracks all of the emails that comes in during the day in real time. And then we also have a system where we will go back and review previous emails that have been given. We take a sample of prior emails. review them and ensure that adequate and accurate information was provided through those. And if there isn't, then we will rectify it with the person we gave advice to and work with staff on ensuring that we give accurate information in the future. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm still channeling the public and not the official, or even if they're not an official, but they're a candidate and they're running for office, they can access this line. So when the public does contact either the advice line or by phone or by email, is the response that you give, we can't help you, or is it you go to our website, look under the education tab? Tell me more about how you try to point them in the right direction, because you mentioned you do try to be as helpful as possible to the public without becoming their lawyer all of a sudden.
Right. Yeah, we would encourage them, and usually we can tell them if we know, what you need to do is look at this campaign manual. You can find it on our website.
Okay, great.
So we don't just hang up the phone.
Yeah, sure. I can't imagine you would.
We try to provide them guidance so they can find their own answer.
Yeah, great. But you try to point them in the right direction and let them do that. Okay.
Right.
And I want to just say, in credit to our colleagues on, I don't even know the name of the committee, it's the public education and engagement or so on. In the last year or two, they went through a real revamp of our website to make it much more user-friendly, and it is. So great work.
Well, thank you. It's an ongoing effort.
Any other questions for Mr. Bainbridge on email advice? All right.
The next is telephone advice. Email advice has really replaced a lot of the telephone advice that we had given in the past. Email is superior because it's in writing, which I think helps everybody involved. But we still have our telephone advice line. This is for very simple questions, or when someone maybe doesn't even know where to start with. They don't know what they need to know. So it's often questions like, what do I need to file? What form is required here? I'm a brand new candidate. What do I do? Those sort of questions are where we would receive telephone and provide advice. It's staffed by our education group. So these are also PRCs. Their main goal or main job is to provide and update our education materials, do our trainings. So this is a subset of what they do, is provide the telephone line. As you can see, our hours are limited. This is just because we only have so much staff, and we like to prioritize providing the educational materials and the trainings. So we do have people available in the mornings, 4 days a week. And then when we get close to filing deadlines, we'll add additional hours where there's someone available on the phone. And that's all posted on our website. So if someone wants to call in, those are the times. If it's 12:30 on a Tuesday, I would encourage you to write in for email advice. You may get your answer before the end of the day rather than wait until the next day to call in on the telephone line. But this is also a service that we provide. Again, same, it's informal, so there's no immunity that attaches. Same requirements that you be asking about someone's duties under the act that you're authorized to, or your own duties. We can't answer questions that are too hypothetical or overly broad, but again, trying to be helpful, and of course, no past conduct.
So just it's a repeat of a question I asked about email advice, kind of. One, do we have a review process, audit process to ensure consistency across advice that we're giving by telephone? And then it's actually a two-part question. Do we have a process to cross-check the advice between telephone and email so it's consistent all the way across the board?
Yes, we do have a process. We have essentially a similar audit process where the supervisor will listen in to ensure that accurate advice is being given. We also, as we go along, if we have a new question come up, or maybe this is something that confuses people, we'll train the staff up on, here's an issue that we're seeing, this is the correct answer. That sort of thing. What was the second question?
Do we have a similar procedure for ensuring consistency, not just within telephone and within email, but between those two? So that somebody asks a question by email and the same question is presented by telephone, they're getting the same answer, is really my question.
Yeah, and it's largely driven by staff communicating with each other. When we have novel questions that come up on the email side, we provide that. We provide a monthly report to other staff, like here's some novel questions that we got in email, and here's how we answered it. And then it's just staff communicating with each other. Hey, I'm seeing this issue, or I've got this question. Have you had that before? And I think the other thing I would say is when we provide advice, staff always needs to be able to cite to something when they give the advice. they don't need to tell the person on the other side of the phone, you know, I'm referring to this code section because they don't care. They just want their answer. But for them to answer a question, they need to be able to point to something in the law or something in our manuals before they give that advice. And if they can't, then they should elevate it to commission counsel or to their supervisor. And eventually it can make its way all the way up to me or even to the commission on whether we should provide advice. So that's our other way of ensuring that we provide consistent advice is kind of, you got to show your work when you provide an answer.
All right, thank you. I appreciate that. Commissioner Wilson?
Oh, Council Bainbridge, as a member of the Public Outreach and Technology Committee, I have a real interest in the tracking of your records, and I'll ask some questions, technical questions of you later. How far back do you archive this information? I know the advice letters, if you go on the website, they're there. But as far as the emails, are those saved 2 years, 5 years? I mean,
They're saved pursuant to our document retention schedule. I don't remember what the time period is for emails. I think it's 5 years, but I'm not
it's just
certain.
more of a technical question. I'll follow up with you later on some other ones.
Okay.
Thanks.
Commissioner Baker?
Yes, thank you. Do you, for the telephone inquiries, is there a track that would say, you know, Assembly member so-and-so called and asked for advice on this? Is there anything that tracks that? Not only for our own, I don't know, tracking what issues come up for educational purposes, but we've seen on the enforcement side, one of the factors that's often mentioned to us in the stipulation is, did they seek advice in advance from the FPPC before they took their action? And if they called on the telephone, is there any record to substantiate if they, I mean, hopefully I'm not trying to help people get around at things, but that they did call. And so can you address that, please?
Sure. I don't know exactly what, phone records are available. We don't keep a log of every person who calls in and write their name and write their question, just frankly because it would take too much time, and that would be time taken away from people actually answering the phone calls. So it's basically whatever the system keeps track of. Maybe it tracks phone numbers that come in, but we don't track the actual advice that's given. This is why I encourage the use of email advice as opposed to telephone advice.
And I don't know if you might not be done with the telephone advice information, but I had other questions that you may be about to answer. So I can wait, or are you done with that slide? Or telephone advice?
No, go ahead and ask.
If I may, sure. Have you had in the last couple of years, particularly during the pandemic or otherwise, times when the advice line was down? And I inquire because if at any time, we're out in the community, public comment, we were actually, the chair and I, down at a conference together, and folks came up to us and said, I called the advice line and I didn't get a response, or I couldn't even leave a voicemail message, or I left a voicemail and never heard back from anyone, which, by the way, just one person's anecdote, you always provide great statistics for us on how quickly, 80% of the time there's a response within a very short period of time. Can you say anything about how you're tracking that, the voicemail box is not full, or that all the calls have been responded to or returned? And were there any times you're aware of recently where maybe the system had a glitch in it, and that you have a way of catching that for times when we might receive that feedback?
I would say Chloe Hackert, who's the supervisor of the education group, is very diligent about ensuring that questions that come in get answered. Now, if they call outside of the hours when the line is available, then they're not going to talk to anybody or get an answer to their question. If they're calling when the line is up, their call is going to get answered, even if the clock hits 11:31. I don't think it's just going to drop off. So I don't think that's a concern. I guess March of 2020, we were down for a little while when we were sent home, and we had to figure out, working with our admin, how people working from home could still answer the phone line. So that took us a little while to get that figured out, so that our PRCs who were required to be at home working could still answer the phone. I don't remember how long it was down, but beyond that, I don't know of a time. There may have been an hour here or there where there was phone issues with the phone company, but no, I think our line has been up during the hours that we say we're up.
Got it. Thank you.
And yeah, there isn't a voicemail service, I don't believe.
I'm sorry, there is or is not?
There is not.
So someone can't leave a message?
No.
Oh,
They
I
have to
see.
call in during the hours, which I understand why people would like to do that, but just from a practical standpoint, then we'd have to spend the next morning going through all the voicemails. That we
Okay,
have.
that's really helpful to know, is that you gotta call during that time period. Otherwise, you won't be leaving a voicemail for someone to return the next day. You're gonna have to start over again.
Right.
Okay,
And,
who knows, maybe that's.
and if that's the case, you should write in for email.
So, yeah, actually, go ahead.
I'm assuming that this is the case. I mean, see, these are logical questions and responses. But if I call and there's not an answer, do I get any kind of advice, if you will? Well, we're not available, send in an email.
Yeah, there's a recording. I'm pretty sure
what I
that says
assumed.
these are our hours and this is the other way you can contact us.
That's what I assumed. Thank you.
An email will pop up on my screen if that's not correct, I'm sure, here in just a second, but that's my understanding.
I do. So another kind of nitty gritty question, because I hadn't thought about this before until Commissioner Baker and Wilson asked these questions. If we only have so many staff answering the phones at a particular time, and if the incoming calls exceed the number of staff who are answering calls, but we don't have a voicemail, what happens?
Well, we
Does it
always
just keep ringing?
They'll be put on hold, and we have a system that is tracking how long people have been on hold.
Okay.
And in instances where we see people are on hold for a long time, maybe we have increased traffic for some reason, we'll have someone else jump on and help out. Typically, we have our PRCs assigned at a time. Again, Chloe, the manager, is tracking this, and if she sees the time gets too long, the person who's the backup that day is also paying attention. And if they see the wait times get too long, then they will jump on and help out.
Okay.
And if we're really low staffed, which we have been recently, we've got a lot of questions this year for around filing deadlines. We have borrowed staff from other parts of the agency to help out with answering the phones.
Okay. Cool. Thank you. Commissioner Wood, before we move on, anything on this point you wanted to ask about?
Sorry, I was looking at the FPPC website and couldn't get over to us. So it sounds like they hear a recording that directs them to email, which I think is useful. We might also put on the informal advice page on the website that outside of the staffed hours, email is a better way to get a response, or you'll get a faster response with email. Because right now it says, it talks about the kinds of things that are best suited to telephone advice, but it doesn't then direct you to email if you're not available during those hours to call. You see what I'm saying? So just to let people know that email's always an option for them, I think would be helpful, just based on conversations I've had with candidates.
Yeah, that seems like a good idea. Mr. Bainbridge?
Yeah, we'll add that on there. We actually just updated this informal advice page this week to make it a little more user-friendly. So we can add that in too. It does mention in bold letters with an exclamation point that email advice is available 24/7. But
That's
I see
true.
the point
I see it there, yeah.
I see your point that if we also say in the telephone advice section, if you're calling and it's not between these hours, you can write in for email. So we'll add that to the website. It's a good suggestion.
All right. Thanks,
thank
Commissioner
you.
Wood. Commissioner Gomez, any questions? All right, Mr. Bainbridge.
All right, I will move on to the last slide here. There we go. I didn't push hard enough. My fault. So the last area of advice is commission opinions. These are also provided for in statute, just like formal advice. And they're similar to formal advice, except that they are approved by the commission itself. They're not just the advice of staff. They have an opportunity for the commission to weigh in on specific facts provided by a requester whose obligations are at question under the Act. So they have a little more, they provide more immunity. They provide immunity in both criminal and civil proceedings. They're still specific to a specific set of facts in person, so they are not precedental either. They're not case law, but they are instructive on how the commission interprets areas of the law. Again, these are used for novel questions or questions involving unsettled areas of the law, where we think it's important that it's not just the opinion of FPPC staff, but it's opinion that's considered by the commissioners and voted on, and it requires 3 votes of the commission in order to adopt an opinion. The basic process for this is that someone can request an opinion. The executive director then reviews that request, and then if they believe it's something that's worthy of the commission's consideration, it's taken to the commission. The commission then votes on whether it wants to issue advice in the first place, and then will vote on whether to adopt a proposed opinion. So sometimes this happens in a 2-step process where staff brings something to the commission and says, do you want to issue an opinion on this question? And then they say yes, and then they typically give direction to staff on maybe what the consensus of what the opinion should be, and it's done in a 2-step process. In other instances, we've done it in a 1-step process. Do you want to issue advice? Yes. Okay, well, here's the opinion, or do you want to issue an opinion? And then here's the opinion that we propose you issue. And so all of our opinions are published. They're on our website. They're also available on Lexis and Westlaw. We do about 1 or 2 a year, I'd say, on average, sometimes less. In the past, there were more, but as the law has gotten older and older, we've worked out a lot of the prior issues. So opinions are fairly rare, and like I said, they come up when we receive questions of interpretation that are not appropriate or not best answered through the advice process. But we think it's an important enough question that the commissioners should weigh in and provide their opinion on the question. I think, and I would just note that commissioners in issuing an opinion are allowed to provide a dissenting or concurring opinions as well. So in that way, it does appear like a court decision, but it doesn't have the same precedental value that a court decision would. I think that's all I have on commission opinions. So if there's any questions on those or anything else, I'm happy to take them.
All right, thank you. Any questions for Mr. Bainbridge on the commission opinions portion of this presentation? Going once, going twice. All right, thank you, Mr. Bainbridge. Let me open up to is there any public comment on any portion of Mr. Bainbridge's informational presentation? We are on item 8, advice services. Hearing and seeing none. Thank you, Mr. Bainbridge. Helpful as always. Appreciate your time and your effort. All right, we'll proceed now to item 9. This is our legislative update from our Senior FPPC Legislative Counsel, Ms. Nakano. And for the benefit of Commissioner Gomez, this is the time of year where Ms. Nakano reports the final results of legislation that we either sponsored last year or that we weighed in on or impacted the Political Reform Act in any way. November is the month in which the commission would then consider our slate of either sponsored or other type of legislation for next legislative cycle. So take it away, Ms. Nakano.
Thank you, and good afternoon, Mr. Chair and Commissioners. Welcome, Commissioner Gomez. Lindsay Nakano, FPPC Senior Legislative Counsel. So last month, I reported that the legislature passed 11 Political Reform Act related bills. This includes the 3 commission-sponsored bills, and the remaining 8 were commission-supported. Pleased to report that all 11 of those bills were signed by the governor. The default operative date for bills passed this year is January 1st of next year. Some of those bills provided for a later operative date, as noted in the legislation report attached to today's agenda. Looking forward to next year, as Chair Matich alluded to, staff is already working hard on research and development of ideas for next year, and we'll be presenting those next month. And that's all I've got for today.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Kano. And let me just say, appreciate your efforts all year. You did a great job, and I think the results speak for themselves. Almost everything that we put out there was passed by the legislature and signed by the governor. So great job this past legislative cycle.
Thank you, my pleasure.
Quick question.
Commissioner
Just for clarification, Mr. Kano, the chair eloquently stated what a great job you've been doing. Now, the recurring payment legislation, that was one of the bills that the FPPC sponsored, and that was in fact passed, correct?
Correct.
Yeah, and the chair and vice chair took the lead on that. There was an editorial in the newspaper, and that was the one issue that people that don't even know I'm on the FPPC asked me and said, "Oh, that's really a good good idea to address that issue. So kudos to, the commission, specifically the chair and vice chair, taking the lead on that issue.
Thanks, Commissioner Wilson. Appreciate it. All right, any other comments for Ms. Nakano?
Echo the comments of Chair, terrific work. And we had a lot of times where we weren't sure what to do about a bill and where it was at. And you really appreciate the organization of your memos and looking forward to good work in the coming year.
All right. Commissioner Wood, anything on Ms. Nakano's report?
Thank you. You're doing great, and I'm grateful for your work.
All right. Any public comment on Ms. Nakano's report? Hearing and seeing none. Thank you, Ms. Nakano. Appreciate it. See you next month. All right, we'll now proceed to item 10. These are executive staff reports. Commissioner Gomez, they're typically presented as submitted unless we have questions for staff based on the reports or unless staff has something they want to highlight in their reports. So first up is Chief of Enforcement Brereton with the Enforcement Division report. Welcome back.
Hello again. I do not have anything specifically to highlight, so if anyone has questions, I'm available.
Thank you. I would just highlight in your report, I think you have the quarterly numbers on our existing workload summarized for commissioners.
That is true.
And so I would just commend everybody to take a look at that. And thank you for providing those quarterly reports to us. So any other questions for Chief Brereton? Hearing and seeing none. Thanks, Chief Brereton. All right. Next up, our Audits and Assistant Division report. Any questions or comments for Chief Shaw? Hearing and seeing none. Thank you, Chief Shaw. Great work. Moving on to the Legal Division report, Mr. Bainbridge. I know you had a lot to say a few minutes ago, but anything you want to point out in the report?
I think I've talked enough.
Okay.
Nothing to add to what's in the report.
Any questions or comments for Mr. Bainbridge? All right, good job, Mr. Bainbridge. Moving right along, our Administrative and Technology Division report, Chief Hahn. Good afternoon. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Chair and Commissioner. I would like to submit the report as is, but I would like to point out that next month you should expect the expenditure report from me for the first quarter of this fiscal year.
We look forward to that, Chief Hahn. Thank you. Any other questions or comments for Chief Hahn? All right, thanks, Chief Hahn. All right, Executive Director West. Anything additional you wish to report on?
No, everything went smoothly today, so good meeting. Nothing else to talk about.
All right. Any questions for Executive Director West? I feel like she's getting off way too easy this month. Like, surely somebody has something to say. All right. Thank you, Ms. West. Appreciate it. Any public comment on any of the executive staff reports? Hearing and seeing none, we'll proceed to our final item. Commissioner comments, proposed future agenda items. This is the item in which if commissioners have specific items for a future agenda, they can identify them now and staff can begin work on those. From our notes today, next month we do have our proposed legislative package, which will come before the commission for consideration. I think I heard an interest in staff coming back with something for us to consider on redacting bank account numbers from forms that are provided to the public under the Political Reform Act, and potentially some proposed statutory changes related to the recall. That is all I have for future agenda items. Other commissioners?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I had one, and it is related to, I'm not sure if it's SB or AB, 1439. This was a legislation, Senior Counsel Nakano was nodding her head, so I think I've got that one right, that we supported. It shorthand is pay-to-play rules at the more localized level. And I would be grateful for, and it doesn't even have to be at the next meeting, but a future meeting, what implementation might look like, or any challenges, or even if we are getting already have a smattering of understanding of the kind of advice line calls we are getting for implementation of that legislation. Again, this was AB or SB 1439. SB, thank you.
All right. Thank you, Commissioner Baker. I think Mr. Bainbridge has that on his list. Commissioner Wilson. Commissioner Wood, anything? Nope. Commissioner Gomez? All right. Well, that brings us to the end of our agenda for today. Do we have a motion to adjourn?
Move to adjourn?
Ms.
I'll
Linker.
second. Okay.
Commissioner Baker,
Aye.
Commissioner Gomez, Commissioner Wilson,
Aye.
Commissioner Wood,
Aye.
Chair Manage.
Aye.
The motion passes.
All right. Thank you, everyone, and great work to all of our staff. Thanks.